I was standing in my yard, shaking from the latest visit from the police. Laura called and mockingly said, "If you don't take down that fence, we'll call the cops again." I realized this wasn't just an argument anymore. This was a battle for my right to peace and quiet. But what happened next shocked me. But let's start from the very beginning. When I bought this house in the suburbs of Chicago, I thought it marked the beginning of a new chapter in my life. I imagined sitting in a cozy living room with a cup of tea, enjoying the quiet and peacefully listening to the leaves rustling in the trees. I dreamed of simple joys, planting flowers, strolling down the streets without haste, and just being alone, far from the city's hustle and bustle. But, as often happens, reality turned out to be quite different. My neighbors, John and Laura, didn't turn out to be just ordinary neighbors. At first, they seemed perfectly normal, even friendly. A few times we exchanged polite greetings in their yard, and I thought they were just like everyone else. Quiet, unobtrusive people you could live next to without ever really having to deal with. But just a few weeks later, everything changed. They started noticing the small things. Right from the first month of me living in the house, they suddenly began to pay attention to my property. At first, it was small, seemingly harmless comments. "Oh, it would be great if you trimmed those bushes," Laura said one morning. I took it as a casual piece of advice and didn't think much of it. But soon, things got more complicated. Every day, John and Laura showed up at my doorstep to advise me on how to make my garden more harmonious. They started dictating what plants I should grow, where to leave the bushes, and where it was better to remove them. Their suggestions had nothing to do with laws or regulations. It wasn't about the garden looking bad or unkempt. No, it was something stranger. They demanded the property look the way they imagined it. It wasn't just land anymore. It was a stage where they decided to act out their scripts. Every time I changed something or planted something incorrectly, I could see the disapproval on their faces. At first, I tried to stay polite and patient. I thought maybe they just cared about the aesthetics and liked things in order. But with each passing day, their demands became more strange and intrusive. They started advising me on the exact color to choose for the fence, how to lay out the paths, and what to plant around the porch. This was crossing the line of normal interaction, but I didn't want to start a conflict. I didn't want to be the center of drama so early in my new life. At some point, I realized my good intentions were running out. I decided to put up a fence. It wasn't just a desire to mark my territory. It was a necessity. I needed a space where I could feel safe and secluded. But as soon as I started installing the fence, everything changed. John and Laura literally exploded. At first, they started complaining that the fence would ruin their view of their perfect garden, that it would obstruct their landscape enjoyment. They said this as if I had personally betrayed their trust. I was shocked. After all, I hadn't broken any rules or intruded on their private lives. But suddenly, my small change was an outright attack on their comfort. In their eyes, there was no understanding, no respect. This wasn't just disappointment. It was complete and utter hostility, turned into complaints that they voiced without hesitation. Every word they said felt like they were the owners of the whole neighborhood, and I was just some intruder who had disrupted their universe. I tried to explain that the fence was my choice, and that I had every right to make my property look the way I wanted. But to them, this was like waving a red flag in front of a bull. They couldn't understand how I could so blatantly ignore their rights to the beauty around them. I felt the tension growing, and I couldn't understand where it was coming from. How had it happened that they, not me, had become the ones in charge of my land? This wasn't just shock. It was a real realization that my neighbors were willing to do anything to interfere with my life. Their complaints seemed absurd and ridiculous, but at some point I realized I couldn't stay silent anymore. I was ready to defend my space, but I knew this conflict wouldn't come without consequences. A few days after I put up the fence, it became obvious that the situation was getting out of hand. My neighbors seemed ready to do anything to force me to back down. One evening, Laura called me, her voice cold and firm, as if she had already made the decision for both of us. "If you don't take down that fence, we'll call the police," she said, and her words sounded like not just a conversation, but an ultimatum. I was stunned. How could they be so brazen as to dictate what I do on my own property? Of course, I could have tried to say something in response, explain that the fence didn't break any laws, that it was my choice, and that I had every right to privacy. But something snapped inside me. This was no longer just a demand. It was war. And I was ready for it. I made up my mind that I would not back down. This was my land, and no one had the right to tell me how to use it. But what happened next was worse than I could have imagined. John and Laura started making endless complaints to local authorities, demanding that my fence be removed immediately. They claimed the fence was illegal and that it violated their rights to freedom and space. I kept trying to understand what they were even talking about. What rights? Their garden, which seemed to be their main concern, hadn't been harmed. They could still enjoy their perfect view of nature. But that didn't matter to them. They were bothered by the mere existence of a boundary between us. With each day, the pressure grew more palpable. Their complaints and threats never stopped. It became full-on harassment, absolutely relentless. They didn't stop at complaints. They took it further, calling the police. Every time I saw a patrol car near my house, I could feel the chills running down my spine. The police actually showed up, conducted inspections, and I had to spend hours proving that the fence was within the law. Sometimes it felt like this whole process wasn't just a strange case, but a series of events deliberately designed to push me to my breaking point. Each visit left me with the feeling that I wasn't just dealing with neighbors, but fighting against the system. I had to keep explaining, over and over, that the fence was installed according to all regulations, that I wasn't breaking any local rules. But they just couldn't calm down. It felt like they were intent on pushing me out, forcing me to give up my right to personal space. This was a fight for survival. What shocked me the most was how aggressively they acted. This wasn't just a fight over pretty views or aesthetics. This was personal. They knew that this fence was my way of setting a boundary, showing that I wasn't going to give in anymore. And to them, this became a personal challenge. Their actions became more cynical, their threats more harsh and determined. I couldn't believe that people could be so reckless. They were putting me through real psychological pressure, as if my personal life and comfort didn't matter to them. What was even more shocking and painfully sad was how I ended up in the center of this chaos. I never imagined that a simple desire for privacy would lead to such a wave of aggression. Local authorities, of course, couldn't just ignore the complaints, and with each visit from the police, the situation became harder and harder. I felt like my life no longer belonged to me. I was trapped in this nightmare, where every step, every move was being scrutinized. But I knew one thing. I wouldn't give up. I wouldn't let these people break me. I would fight for my home, my fence, my right to peace. But I understood that a bigger battle lay ahead. Each visit from the police became more and more of a trial for me. At first, they came just as inspectors, but with each subsequent visit, their presence became increasingly oppressive, and their questions more insistent. I began to understand that the situation with the fence had long passed the point of a simple neighborhood dispute. It had become unbearable pressure on my personal life, and, most importantly, on my sense of justice. The first time the police arrived due to my neighbor's complaints, I still hoped it was some kind of mistake. I thought that by explaining my side of things, everything would be resolved. But when the officers started asking me detailed questions about my fence, my plans for the yard, and, most strangely, Whether I was violating any unwritten neighborhood rules, something snapped inside me. I felt irritation starting to rise. Why should I have to justify my choices regarding my own home? Why did I have to explain that my fence was simply a means of creating privacy, with no impact on anyone else? When I tried to explain that the fence didn't violate any codes, the officers seemed to doubt my words. They appeared uncomfortable, almost as if they were searching for a hidden motive in my actions, as though I were guilty for making my neighbors feel offended. And that made me wonder, had they started to believe their version of events? Each subsequent visit got worse. My calmness eroded with each encounter. I felt like a puppet in the hands of these people who wouldn't stop until they got what they wanted. This was no longer just an invasion of my personal space. It was an attack on my freedom and my right to decide how I wanted to live. What would happen if I gave in to their demands? It would only give them the green light to take the next step. What if they started dictating what I could build on my property, what plants to grow, what decorative elements to use? Where would the line be drawn? They began using intimidation tactics that slowly turned my home into a rented lot. One evening, Laura called me, her voice cold and determined, as if she had already made a decision for both of us. "If you don't take down that fence, we will call the police," she said, and her words sounded like an ultimatum. I was stunned by her audacity. How could she think she had the right to dictate what I should do with my own property? Why should I be at fault for her not wanting to lose her view of the garden? Each new complaint to the local authorities, every threat, and even personal attacks, it all became a real nightmare. At one point, I felt like I was trapped in a psychological snare. They were doing everything to create pressure, making me feel like a criminal. Their complaints became increasingly absurd, and I realized that this whole story wasn't just about getting me to take down the fence. It was a full-on moral assault that I didn't know how to handle. But eventually, on the day of yet another police visit, I could no longer hold back. It felt like the last straw. When one of the officers said that I might be violating the unwritten norms of the neighborhood, I felt a fury boiling inside me. I understood that this wasn't just a conflict with neighbors. It was a battle to preserve even a shred of my independence. I couldn't allow my right to privacy to become a bargaining chip. I decided to act decisively. From that moment, I knew I couldn't just keep tolerating it. I had to file a complaint with the local authorities. This wasn't just a petition. It was my way of declaring that I would not follow the rules they were trying to impose on me. I gathered all the evidence, photographs of the fence, recordings of conversations where Laura and John made threats, and, of course, videos showing them trying to invade my territory. I knew this might only escalate the situation, but at that point, I saw no other way out. I couldn't let myself be yet another person who gave in under pressure. The letter to the authorities was my act of defiance, my assertion of my right to live life on my own terms. I wrote it, not hiding my anger. The local authorities needed to see that I wasn't the one at fault. It was my neighbors who were, in essence, destroying my peace. When I sent the complaint, I felt the weight of tension lift slightly. Although I didn't yet know how it would end, I was determined to fight for my property and my rights. It's hard to describe how I felt when I was informed that the situation had turned in my favor. But when that day came, and I finally understood that not only had I not been blamed, but the authorities had started taking action to protect me, the feeling was incredible. It was like the long-awaited light at the end of the tunnel. The light I hadn't been able to see despite all my efforts and the nerves I'd spent on this battle. After the police completed their investigation, I received a letter stating that my fence did not violate any laws and that all of my neighbors' complaints were unfounded. It explained that I had acted within my rights and that, in this context, my neighbors had no right to interfere in my personal affairs or make demands. The local authorities confirmed that, by law, I had the right to erect a fence, and that their actions, systematically invading my privacy and trying to intimidate me, went beyond acceptable boundaries. They were fined and warned not to interfere with my rights again. I remember sitting in my chair, carefully reading those words, and feeling the tension slowly drain from my body. All this time I had been on edge, but now, with the law on my side, I felt like a winner. The sense of justice and truth was more powerful than ever. I even started to feel a little sorry for my neighbors, because I knew they were about to face an unpleasant path. John and Laura could no longer threaten me. Their threats and complaints had been completely debunked as empty. They had tried to fight for something they couldn't control, and now there was no retreat for them. Under pressure from the law, they began to pack their things. It was a strange sight. People who had spent so much time trying to interfere in my life were now themselves the objects of pressure. At one point, when they started hauling their belongings out of the house, I saw Laura through the window. She looked utterly defeated. It was hard for me to understand what they had even been trying to achieve, but at the same time, I felt not so much gloating as relief that this chapter in my life was finally over. They left without a word, almost silently, as if they didn't want to admit that they had lost. Their departure was unexpected for me, and even a bit empty. At first, when they started causing all these problems, I thought the process would drag on for a long time. But when they actually left, I felt a certain emptiness. Not the kind of emptiness one feels in moments of stress, but more like a sense of completion. For me, this wasn't just a victory. It was confirmation that, in my own yard, in my own home, I was the master, and no one could dictate the terms. But as pleasant as this moment was, it gave me so much more than just physical relief from the neighbors. I realized that I had restored not only my rights, but my inner freedom. By putting up the fence, I didn't just protect my private space. I restored my self-respect. I learned not to be afraid to stand my ground, not to give in to pressure. At some point, I understood that this situation had become a kind of lesson, not for my neighbors, for me. I became more confident in myself, in the belief that my space and my decisions mattered. Now, weeks after they left, I still often look at the fence, but with a completely different feeling. It has become a reminder of what it means not to let others dictate the terms of your life. After all, everyone has the right to their own space and to choose how they live. And if it takes a fight to defend that, then so be it. Justice has triumphed. But perhaps the most valuable thing for me was realizing that you must always stand up for your right to peace and personal freedom.